usually whenever. Now it's recording.
Yeah, now it's recording.
All right. All right. Hi, you guys. So this scintillating book, Theoretical Framework. I actually really enjoyed this a lot. So, all right. So we read chapter 3, chapter
6.
6, and chapter 8.
Yeah. Oh, we're kind of, in my screen at least, we're in order of our chapters.
All right. So, all right. Well, I was chapter 3. I guess I can dive in. I even wrote something up about this. I really chose this because it said struggling with theory was I'm like, okay, I relate to that. And it said how a novice researcher really kind of approached working with a particular theoretical framework. And honestly, I did not relate to this. Like, as I started reading it, I'm like, all right, this is about, political science and educational reform theory. It's interesting, but it's not at all in my wheelhouse. So I thought it was just going to be interesting, but not particularly relevant. And what I found out is actually it was quite relevant and very interesting. And I love the way the researcher kind of walked through her journey, kind of, both from when she had to choose a theory, when she was working on her dissertation, people who were working, she was in the field of educational politics. It was kind of interesting. So she is now a emeritus professor, retired as far as I can tell, but she kind of walks through her whole kind of, her experience from being a young novice person working on her dissertation, where people who had an EDD could write it, they could write about anything. It didn't have to have any particular theory, but for the PhD, she had to choose an established social theory. And she had oh my gosh, so she had to go read about what they called these grand social theories and choose from them. Like, she just had to pick one. And she was really curious about a big issue that was going on in her area, in terms of, both from the perspective of her field, but also there was a lot of kind of rancor and irritation over a bill that was passed in the Ohio legislature that had to do with school choice. But it appeared as though it was really kind of run I think the word they used was that it was sort of just kind of rushed in, whatever the word is. It was clearly there were some political interests that kind of made this very fast track without input from the public so much, or without so much input even from educators. So there was a lot of people really angry and complaining. And she said, well, that's interesting. Let's find out, is there a theoretical framework that I can actually see? Was this, kind of rushed through? Or really, was it a fair process? And just going by articles in the newspaper, or on television, you can't, watching television, you can't necessarily tell, just because there are political sides and parties to things. So she found a model that she had heard about and read about while she was, around the time she was working on her dissertation, sometime after that, automatically seemed to kind of fit. It was called an arena model. And the shaper of the model was a Dr. Tim Mazzoni, who was also concerned he was in Minnesota, was concerned about some policy that seemed like it had some possible either shady interests, or that, very kind of a similar kind of a thing, a bill that was passed. And when he applied his particular model, he thought there were going to be two kind of arenas that had maybe more of a say. One he called a subsystem model, which was, well, I can't believe I'm remembering this. It's so interesting. That was kind of more like the public and the mass media, and maybe some educational organizations. He called that subsystem. And then there was this other one that he called, now I have to remember what the other one was called. The second one was called, I should remember this. All right. Well, maybe I should just read what I wrote. Anyway, it had to do more with, oh, okay. I'm just going to read what I wrote. But anyway, there was this other one that had looked like it was here. I'm just going to open up what I wrote, you guys. Sorry about that.
You're good.
Like fancy terminology. Yeah. So the first one was called substance. The second one he called macro arena, which that was the one that was comprised of the general public. The subsystem was different education committees in both houses of legislature, the State Department, so kind of more official. And so when he applied the model, he actually realized that it was neither of those, and that so he amended the model to, because it did look like there were maybe more powerful individuals with political, sort of ends in mind. So that he called the leadership arena. And then a fourth one he called a commission arena, which, because there are these commissions that review these. So he wanted to see basically looking who was exerting influence. So Frances Fowler, who is the author of this chapter, thought this would be an ideal framework for her study, looking at something similar that had gone on in Ohio. And what was very neat is not only she talked about how she chose the model, others that she looked at, why it was a fit, how she approached it as sort of as a novice researcher in a way. Now, this wasn't for her dissertation. This was when she got her first job as an assistant professor somewhere, where there's like this mandate to publish or perish, where she knew she had to start writing some articles that were kind of based on her dissertation. And this just looked like a natural one. And so when she wrote this, where it was published in 1994, Mazzoni's theory came out and was published just a few years earlier in 1991. And so it seemed relevant and a good fit. So the chapter really walks through how she assessed these models. And then what I thought was really neat, is so instructive for, as even if the model isn't exactly in our discipline, this talk, and I recommend the chapter, and you can read what I wrote because I did a synopsis of it. She talks about how theory helped not only give her a feeling of confidence in approaching the research, it helped frame her research questions. And she talks about, it was almost like a sieve. Even when she looked at the literature, it became really kind of clear. She had gathered, as you guys, we probably are already gathering like a ton of literature for our potential inquiries. I have so many files of stuff. She talked about how once she really applied the theoretical framework, it was like a sieve, like so much stuff that was like sand just kind of fell through. And the big rocks that she could see, that's really where the evidence lay. So she was able to like move a whole lot of her files out of the way, and she had a smaller subset that was really relevant. She said it also guided her both planning the research, the whole focus of the research, and it also helped her guide her data analysis. So it had all of the points, how it was so helpful. And then last but not least, because she assumed that the person she chose was so experienced, and like here she was a young professor and this guy was near kind of like an older gentleman at the end of his career, she just like took on face value that this framework was like true, and that it was, so she really, the way she framed her questions were the extent to which what had happened fit either one of his particular models, A or B, kind of the first model, and then how he amended it. But what she realized afterwards is that she discovered gaps in his model, and she also ended up writing a bit of a critique that turns out she found out he was actually very impressed by and pleased with. So how, as researchers, using frameworks are a really great guide, but that we should feel like a feeling of like not to be afraid to look for problems with them, to maybe use more than one. So she talked about using multiple frameworks. It was a really good chapter. I think the whole book seems like the chapters are really kind of organized in a way that that are really instructive for us, to kind of get it step by step. So I actually found it kind of fun, and I wrote in my write-up that I didn't expect reading it was almost like reading a mystery novel, because there was kind of intrigue. where there was foul play perhaps, and people were acting badly, and it was like she was trying to kind of solve a puzzle and solve a mystery. And so I thought that was kind of neat. It gave an angle on research that to bring our curiosity, and we are going to try to like hopefully unearth you know unforeseen patterns and things like that. So I thought that was really cool. So I got my big take home was that it was actually quite relevant, and and I don't know in my own inquiry what the arenas all are, but I think there might even be something from the model that I could use. So we'll see.
I'm curious for all of you guys, did each of the chapters, because it sounded like for yours, Lisa, that there was this kind of that maybe did the art, like did Francesca, is that what her name was?
Oh, Frances Fowler.
Or Fowler, did Fowler like use that model over years, like that same like framework? Like was that something that they, and I don't know whether or not like all of her
I think she used it in a couple of other pieces of policy. So just as a backup, the model was designed by Mazzoni in order to assess educational policy in particular. So it
it's
really
interesting. I wonder if it's going to be like, because from my chapter, and I don't know about for your chapter, Erin, but it seemed like there was a connection to come and to, like at least the author I read about, they seem to keep going back to that same framework, right? And I wonder if there's some possibility that we'll find kind of this framework and kind of get really kind of buried in the details of it, I guess, and kind of like what about like this little aspect, and what about this kind of aspect?
Well, it was interesting because there were kind of these meta theories. So there was one that she used early on in the front end for her with her dissertation that was looking at pluralism, and again, she was very young and new at this and everything like that. And she basically applied a model that sounded really good, but it wasn't actually really just the right fit. It was like, it seemed like a good fit. She chose it. It was the closest one she could find. And then when she had her committee look at it, like there was actually somebody in her committee, and he said, she was studying something like, I think it was like something with, something with politics in France during a certain period that had to do with like more political science, and critiqued it. And she's like, oh my goodness, like, so, but it still worked in some way. So it doesn't have to actually be so matchy-matchy. It's got to be kind of enough to help guide at least the way you frame it. And then if you can at least explain why you chose it and how it works. But anyway, this meta one that she used, she chose another framework that had like this 6-step model that she used for each step, for each one of the arenas. So like, so you can be flexible, I think. So, it wasn't like she said, this is the greatest thing since sliced bread, and I'm only going to use this model. She talked about its merits, and she also talked about the shortcomings. That was pretty neat. And some of the shortcomings that she talked about, she had discovered. So that was kind of cool. The sun is setting, and it's beaming right through my window again. So I'm going to go pop out, close my shades, because it's obviously I'm glowing here, but I'll be right back. Okay. Talk amongst yourselves.
Yeah, that was the kind of sense I got from the chapters in general. They almost seem like case studies of like different research projects, which I thought were kind of cool because it was more of like a researcher point of view and like their experience with the process rather than like an article about like the research, which I thought was really valuable because it gives you the, again, insider view to the process and like the thought process behind it and the theories and kind of why and why not. And like the author of my chapter did the same thing, right? Where they kind of talked about the, the greater context for things, the frameworks and kind of why and where that came from and what was helpful and then what was limiting as well. And how that had the impact of their specific project. And kind of that, like what kind of comes to me is like the idea of take what serves you and leave the rest, where it's really just that kind of guided structure that framework. So you're not all over the place. You have some guiding light, but you're not set into these rigid, strict boundaries or rigid points of view. It leaves a lot of space for exploration and creativity, and really expansion of understanding and knowledge, rather than like, I have this hypothesis and it's based off of this theory and I'm going to look for exactly that. So that's probably what I'm going to find, at least on some level.
Yeah, that would probably be really constraining. Right? And actually, you'd probably miss a lot if you're just so narrow, right? What was your chapter? Can you tell us about it?
Yeah, so my chapter was actually kind of cool. It was about like organizational culture and organizational identity. So it was, I think the chapter itself was only written by one person, but it was these two researchers that were part of a university, and there was a big organizational like restructuring of departments. So they were originally, and they didn't specify like which departments and whatnot. They were all kind of like educational, social science, like humanities kind of related. But both of them were originally in different departments and then ended up in this new department, which was called like Department of Educational Studies. And so it was a 2-year process of this big, like, again, university reorganization process, and the impacts of it, which was really cool. So it was based on a lot of the theoretical framework that they originally had talked about, was the organizational identity and identification. So that was a very like social constructionism viewpoint, which from my understanding was like the one, I guess he was a professor, so professor's viewpoint of like social constructionism, and more based on like sociology and that kind of viewpoint of how our context really informs like who we are and who we identify as, and putting that in like educational department viewpoint, as well as like the individual faculty members that were being reintegrated into this new organization. And then the other researcher was looking at things, again, kind of from like a similar standpoint, because she also had like an educational, background of like a similar, kind of general field of study. Like she was talking about this, this concept of liminality, I guess that's how you pronounce it, which I thought was really cool, like talking about these liminal spaces in between one thing and another. So like a transition essentially, and like really looking at that and how, within the social constructionism viewpoint of this organizational culture and the individual identities and greater identity that goes into that, saying if you're taking like these, like I think it was 5 different departments that have their own culture, right? Their own viewpoints, their own frameworks, and then you're putting them all together into one. How do you make this new whole, right? And I was like, oh, look, it's transdisciplinarity. It's a transdisciplinarity team, but it's a transdisciplinarity department. So I'm going to look down at my notes because I want to make sure I'm actually talking about what I want to talk about. Yeah, so there was a lot of talk about, again, kind of like sociological, like specific theories, like social identity theory and self-categorization, whatever, it's late, theory. And like the hypotheses there that like people, if people have all these rigid norms, mergers can be really hard because everyone's trying to do old ways of functioning, and everyone's doing it 5 different ways. And then also that identification can be difficult if people are too similar to each other too, because then there's just like no boundaries and no differentiation or no difference of opinions. It's all just, again, the same thing, even though you just merged 5 different ones, like why would the new one be the same as the 5 others? And then this idea that, if there are more differences, that you can increase the identification of the new whole by, if there's like this new whole is now more prestigious, or, there are a decent enough of differences. So there's like weird balance. And so there was a lot of focus on like interaction and sense making, like in the integration process. And then the aspect that the other researcher brought in was this idea of like this liminal space, if we can have this interaction while also accepting differences and like contradictions, then that's kind of where the power is, which again is reflective of that social constructionism, like acknowledging that multiplicity exists and using this as this new like liminal space where this is this whole new area where there aren't any rigid boundaries or expectations like there is in the individual ones or in this new whole. We're in this in between where we get to kind of create this together, and there is no hierarchy, right? None of that exists. So these opportunities that don't exist in society in general or in other realms now exist here for this temporary period of time. So how does that impact our department? And it was cool because, I mean, they were saying it was very helpful to understand things in this broader context and be able to have words for this very like nebulous kind of experience of a transition of departments. Like, how do you even, you know, look at that? And they use qualitative research. They actually had all the faculty members keep journals for like the entire first year and then coded the crap out of that, which I can't even imagine how long that took. But yeah, probably very, very interesting.
Were the researchers like from center to inside those 5 departments, or were they on the outside? Yeah,
they were inside. So both of them were from one of these departments and then ended up on this new, like in this new department together. And so had decided, hey, during this process, we're both interested in this. Let's study what a reorganization looks like from the ground up, essentially, instead of looking back on it and reflecting on the process afterwards.
Would they have considered that participatory? The fact that everybody, like, did they call out what the, the methodology was in that, just the fact that everybody...
No, not as participatory. They did say the theoretical framework was organizational identity, and then also this like liminality concept, and then mentioned like social constructionism and whatnot, and specifically talked a lot about the qualitative methodologies and the oh my God, I just blanked, coding, and like the coding and how they did that, and gave some examples of that. So to me, it speaks a little bit as participatory. And like the faculty members knew what was going on and were kind of part of it, but weren't part of the research design. And I don't think they had too much say in that. So I don't know if it would fully be participatory. And they said qualitative multiple times. So I think it was, again, this kind of like in between, where the framework to me, again, was more of this like organizational studies kind of umbrella. And then this liminality, oh my God, concept, which I think originally is from like anthropology. And they talked about the limitations with that was a lot of the research and existing information about liminality was with individuals and kind of looking at that kind of like personal identity rather than like social change and like transformation within a structure. So they were talking a little bit about that was kind of a gap or a little bit limiting and wasn't a perfect fit, and how it created this great framework to look at potentials for social change to happen in a way that is a little bit newer, right? Because we're putting this like liminal space on it instead of just immediately merging or shifting, like allowing some openness and unknowns for actual change to happen rather than forcing it. At least that's what I kind of got out of it. And they were saying too, there weren't any, like with this concept in the social change, there weren't any clear markers of what was before and what was after, because it was an ongoing process. And I don't even want to use the word integration, because integration to me, again, kind of like looks at like all of these parts becoming a whole. And I didn't really, then the way they talked about it, it wasn't necessarily that. It was kind of all of these kind of parts coming together to create some kind of change, not necessarily a separate whole, and also not just separate parts that were, part of this new whole. So I don't know if I even described that well.
Making something new, kind of.
Yeah.
So can I ask, is the liminal, because it's not a word I'm familiar with, is that, so there's this idea that like, and I don't live in a really big city, but if you live in a larger city and you're not during a pandemic, there's this collision that happens where there's kind of like there's going to be more ideas that just happen because you're likely to be walking out to the store and you're going to bump into more people, and like it's not that there's a structure set up saying, hey, we're going to meet every week and try to be creative, but that there's going to be kind of other stuff that happens because there's more people around, and it like you're just kind of setting up the structure to be able to have more potential collisions. Is that kind of a similar concept, or?
It's actually, I think, kind of the opposite, where it's like there's more openness and less structure. So not necessarily like a chance of, and actually, I don't know, maybe that is part of it. There's chances for more of these interactions to happen that maybe wouldn't normally, but more of like there is not clear boundaries the way there was or the way that there will be. So it's this very like transitory, fleeting period of time that is very unique. And they actually use the example, and I'm going to butcher it, but like it was the example of like before somebody gets married, it's like there's this period of time where like you are, you know, engaged and about to become like a bride or whatnot, but you're not yet at that point. And so it's a very short period of time where everything is shifting. And, you know, I mean, I think
single, but you're not married. So you're like in this liminal in between, like
a liminal space.
Like a bridge.
I think of like limbo, like literally like
limbo.
purgatory, you know, although I think that's actually a little bit more like constraining, but this idea of this is just this like, I don't know, like again, like more nebulous, no social norms, no hierarchy, in a way where we can try to take those things away, but they still exist all around us, you know? So this is a different, like, you know, outside of the social norm experience that doesn't exist in a lot of places. And so it's created in this transitory period.
Did they give their department a name? I mean, did they on their own, or was it told? Were they told what they call? Like, did they? Department
of Educational Studies. I don't.
Okay.
I don't know who came up with that or whatnot, but yeah, I think it was just probably a combination of all these different departments that like was the catch-all for what it encompassed.
How would you apply it to your inquiry? Perhaps I'm wondering anything about it that for you.
I really liked the concept of liminality. Like that really, really stuck out to me. And again, like a way that I think we've talked a lot about with like transdisciplinary and creating expansion and creativity, and it gave it like a concept and some, you know, other research behind like a different way of framing that, which I thought was cool. And I think just the idea of seeing again how they went through the process of doing this research and how they pulled from different theories from different disciplines, and kind of use this general framework of looking at organizational identity and culture as what was really informing and guiding them throughout the entire process, regardless if they were like how they were doing the qualitative data and who they were having participate and what theories they pulled from. You know, obviously the theories again like fit within the framework, but it's not necessarily a perfect fit. And, you know, it's kind of this big umbrella. And I think it was nice to see and walk through an entire research project like that in some detail, rather than just talking about it in bits and pieces or trying to put my own research that's in its very beginnings in that, but actually like seeing kind of the whole process, and how they put that into articles too, and how they wrote about it, was very, very helpful. So yeah, cool. I think that's all I have to say about that.
I don't know. I would really agree with that kind of, it sounds like all of us feel like kind of the in-depth focus on like how this one researcher, how this group of researchers went through and understood a theory is like super helpful. And because like the first couple of chapters of the textbook, and then we read the last chapter, I think, in the last module or whatever, it like I've liked it, but it's pretty academic and dry, and it's kind of like you have to kind of sit with it a little bit, and it's a lot of like, here is serialized comments and this and that and this other thing, and it's very dense, right? And the kind of these chapters seem like they're, and I'm assuming that that's what all of the chapters are like that are kind of in the middle of the book.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
Are like a story of this researcher, and it's a very engaging way to kind of consider it. I like that.
Yeah, I'm guessing that the shapers, you know, Anfara and Mertz gave them each their little template and said, here you guys. They probably all, the fact that so many things in there about education, you know, maybe they were just a bunch of folks who all belong to some, you know, organization or whatever, a bunch of colleagues, they invite
I'm
a
sure
lot
if
of
they're
students.
all researchers, they're probably all at some institution, you know?
Sure. Tell us your story, the story of your research from the perspective of theory. That's pretty cool.
Right. We all love talking about our own research, right? So that probably wasn't very hard to do.
In order to get people to be willing to buy in. So the one I read about was it was around using typology and kind of this idea of grid and group, which comes from Mary Douglas. And the author is Edward Harris. And, you know, it was really interesting. Like when we were picking which ones, I went and kind of looked at them, and I saw that this one was like about an article published in the Journal of School Leadership, and was kind of like, how do we think about school climate, and how do we come and interpret school climate? And so I found that really interesting. I tried to actually find the article that they cited, right? Like, so, I mean, the author didn't go through and kind of describe all of the article, but just kind of, you know, I think all of them are based on a specific one, but it was one that it doesn't look like we have access to, and there's no like open access stuff to. Although it's older, and it sounded like maybe all of them were kind of older articles too. I wonder if that was kind of
mine was 1994.
Yeah, mine was 95, because the textbook is fairly recent, but it seems like it's really meant to be kind of, at least like this a post-mortem, right? To kind of look not back at a recent event, but to look back kind of further. And so the article that I was looking at, or that Harris kind of talked about and talked through and kind of used this typology of grid and group, and was from 1995. And, you know, he got it from this Mary Douglas, and she's actually an anthropologist. So I guess I felt like I kind of had a little bit of a like, oh yeah, there's a little bit of kind of this transdisciplinary in this, that this kind of pulling things from one area and kind of bringing it into another. And kind of in his discussion, I found it interesting that he was talking about he kind of described that his understanding and connection with kind of this grid and group typology has expanded over time. And so he talked about other articles and things that he's published looking at that, and how kind of other researchers have kind of applied that to school culture. But it really gave me the impression that it wasn't something that it's like, oh yeah, I read this thing one time and then I just kind of grabbed it, but that he really kind of grappled with it, right? And it was something that was this multi-year process, and kind of getting more depth and kind of understanding. And so he talked about how, like, well, when I first was starting to understand, there was kind of this, and then I started to see it in this other way, and so that there's kind of been new realizations that have come out. And so I always appreciate that, because I think sometimes in my mind I want to, like, oh, I should just be able to read this thing and then we should go and move forward, right?
That's not how it works?
No, I don't think so. I wanted to, maybe, or like, or I feel like I should be able to do that. And so it always makes me maybe feel better about myself if I'm a little slow at like kind of making all of the connections, or kind of seeing it in the different lights that it can be in. So kind of this, a typology of grid and group. I mean, really, it's kind of like it's 4 quadrants, right? So there's kind of an up and a down, which is related to a grid, and that, so they break it up, and there's this grid and a group, right? And so the vertical version of that is kind of a grid, and it's really around the structures of the organization. So, how much autonomy do they give to the person? How specifically are like roles and rules defined? Are there like specific expectations and procedures? What's the kind of the power centralization that happens, right? So if it's a really strong grid, then it tends to be more corporate or bureaucratic, right? But it tends to be more like kind of authoritarian, right? Like that there's more structure. And then on the horizontal line is kind of this weak group versus a strong group. And it's all around how people have allegiances, kind of the pressure to participate in things, how incorporated people are in participating in activities, how kind of important how prioritized my interests are versus the interests of the entire group, and kind of where that falls at. And so kind of the idea is that you can take this grid or this matrix and to be able to kind of plot points on there, right? Like, does it fit, within kind of a weak group, or is it a strong group? And is it a strong grid versus a weak grid? And to be able to connect that to the school climate, to be able to say, this is a way of defining and describing school climate, which is pretty interesting. And then there's kind of a typology that goes with that. So they talk about like an individualist is a weak grid with a weak group, where a bureaucratic is strong grid with weak group, or corporate is a strong grid with a strong group, and collectivist, which would be the weak group with the strong group.
Okay, so it's kind of like a Myers-Briggs for organizations in a way. It's like like you say, a typology where it gives you like you can kind of know who you're dealing with an organization. I bet that would be interesting. Probably would match up in some ways with like corporate or entrepreneurial or like different types of business organizations. But they're talking about school school culture here. And when you're talking about school, what are the is it K through 12? Is it higher ed? What is it what they're looking at?
So he didn't really, I believe that it was K-12. That's the impression I got. I didn't see anything that specifically talked about that, but kind of the school climate, it seemed to be kind of what the researchers' focus was. Yeah, so it was pretty interesting. I mean, I kind of found it interesting too. He talked about kind of applying this theory, and I had never seen priori or post priori, which I guess are both but like from the earlier, like this idea of like, can we take this theoretical framework before we start doing research, and which would be the priori, and apply it and say, hey, we're going to look for, like, we're going to try to figure out who fits within this individualistic. Does the school climate fit into this individualistic, or this bureaucratic, or this corporate, or this collectivist? But that you could also come and do a kind of prostori, where you're doing it after the fact. Because the researcher really seemed like he was most of his qualitative research he had done has been kind of that grounded theory, where you're collecting lots of data and you're kind of gathering all of that and reading through it, and then you're finding themes within that, right? And so, but he was talking about how you can take these type of theoretical frameworks and to be able to sometimes come and apply them after the fact. So you've kind of gathered all of this information, you've started to see some of those themes, and then it becomes really clear that, oh yeah, this fits in this grid, right? This fits in this kind of group. And so to be able to kind of have the flexibility to use some of these theories or these theoretical frameworks to kind of approach them from different perspectives.
Okay, so the beginning one, just to clarify, that helps the researcher kind of like what I was describing a little earlier, like frame the questions and set up the study and then learn how to look at the data. But with the post priori one, it's like it's only used as sort of a data analysis tool on some level, right? Like it's not, it doesn't set up your study. It's just sort of you bring in the framework as a way to make sense of the data, et cetera. Is that what you're going for?
Yeah, that's what he was expressing, at least, that it seemed like he talked about how in different studies that he had done it kind of in both ways, right? That sometimes it had kind of framed that discussion, and then sometimes he had come back and seen how that could apply through that lens, kind of after having collected all the data. So, which it just, I guess it makes it relevant that whether or not we are actively using a theoretical framework, right? Whether or not like that's in our mind and that we're like explicitly saying that we're doing that, we are, right? Like that there is some sort of a framework that's happening.
It's still there.
Yeah, it's still there. It's just whether or not it's being explicitly.
Well, interestingly, I know we're going to be looking at that, finding the theory, in your research, right? So that's sometimes we'll go hunting and say, gee, maybe what framework have I, maybe been operating on that I didn't even know had a name or.
Yeah, I feel like that happened to me. I was like talking about stuff and I was on a call with May. She was like, well, it sounds like this is your framework. And I was like, oh, yeah,
Yeah.
you're right. Like, I didn't even know, but I already knew. It guides you and informs you, right?
Right. Cool. Yeah, no, because we probably all are. Why do we, like, as a therapist or as an educator or a social worker, like what we have an approach, like I've approached as a coach. Well, and I'm sure I've been influenced by certain people and writings and, so there's some frameworks interdigitating in this.
I always say I'm eclectic, and that's always how I, put my perspectives too. Like I definitely have things that like guide me more than others, but I definitely pull from a little bit of everything.
Wow. Cool.
So,
wow. Well, did you guys feel complete? I thought this was great, and I enjoyed learning about your chapters that you read. And
yeah,
I'll have to figure out how to post it again. Either that, or I'll send it to you, Erin, because I know we got it on.
Yeah, you can do that.
YouTube, etc. All right. Okay, everyone. Well, whoever's watching this, hope this was scintillating and fun for you, and you learned about 3 other chapters in Anfara and Mertz, Theoretical Frameworks and Qualitative Research. The end.
Awesome.
Cool.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Night, you guys.
See ya.
Right.